So that's a little bit about the theory. And now I want to talk about the practice in what was probably the most dramatic event of my time in prison. And I want to welcome the students from the class that are studying how to facilitate difficult conversations. Because this parole hearing was a mediated conversation along the most extreme enmity that I can imagine between individuals. The family of a person who was murdered and one of the people who participated in the acts that resulted in his death. And the idea that there was peace to be made somehow in that process is a profoundly radical idea, and I was trying to make my way toward it. So a little bit of background is that I was sentenced to 8 to 12 years, and my attorney said that means 5 years to serve, and only after I was already in prison did I learn that that meant 5 years till parole eligibility. And defense attorneys think if you haven't, if you've been well behaved, parole is a given. People who are concerned with the scales of justice think it's a release from suffering a little bit too early. And those tensions are part of what goes on in the two poles of that conversation. So I'll start here. I surrendered to try to put right what I had wronged. I knew that I would have to pay something to the state, and I also knew I owed something to Walter Schroeder's family and community. My prison sentence would satisfy the statutory obligation to the state, whether I served it in full in Framingham or under supervision on parole. But I had yet to present myself utterly undefended before the people whose father, husband, brother, friend had been murdered in my step into violence. To show that I had harmed them, that I saw how I was responsible for my actions that resulted in their sorrow. I wanted to take the opportunity of a parole hearing to sit before a parole board that would ask searing questions, to listen to the Schroeder family's statements about me, and declare my responsibility and sorrow without limitation, without justification, with nothing held back. Only if I could do this would people feel that justice had been done. Now, I'm going to go to what happened in that room. Around 4, a team came in and uncuffed me from the chair. "It's time," they said. They walked me down the hall into the hearing room. The 5 members of the parole board sat at a table in the front of the room. A table for whoever was speaking faced them. The rest of the room was arranged in what I had learned in the catering business as classroom style. 30 or so chairs faced the front of the room. The officers led me to the table at the front of the room. My hands remained uncuffed, but the shackles remained on my ankles. "Miss Power," one of the board members began, "we understand that your behavior while incarcerated has been exemplary, that you have been a fine and upstanding citizen at Framingham. If everyone there behaved as you have, it would be a lovely place to be. But that is not what we are here to consider today. Instead, we will be deciding whether the interests of justice are served by your release from prison to the community on parole at this time." The statement I had written in answer to the parole questionnaire had been presented to the board members. They questioned me for more than an hour. 2 moments stand out in my memory. One of them read from my statement, "I went along riding a high of pent-up anger finally released. The relief that came from feeling finally able to do something, anything to feel useful instead of powerless." Finally able to do something, anything, he said. Would that include something like the bombing of the Oklahoma City courthouse where 168 people were killed? I started to protest. I would never have done something like that. I never set out to harm anyone. I could see how empty this rang. Why should he believe me? After all, I had gone beyond what I thought I would. Why not all the way to the slaughter of children? The other question I remember is, why do you think we should grant you parole, Miss Power? Do you think you have served a long enough sentence for the murder of Walter Schroeder? I don't want parole for myself, I said. I could serve the rest of my sentence, but my son needs me. This is a difficult time in his life. I need to be there for him. Do you realize the profound irony of what you are saying, Miss Power? He responded. After all, Walter Schroeder's children had needed him too, but he hadn't been there for them because a gang of gun-toting bank robbers had murdered him. I could not argue that I had not fired a gun at anyone or been on the scene. This was a time to entirely ignore the fine points about limited legal responsibility and claim my human responsibility. Throughout all this back and forth, I could tell that what I had come there to do was not happening. I did not know how to shift the conversation to my sorrow for my part in Walter Schroeder's death. After this questioning, I was moved to a seat at the side of the room. It was time for the people who opposed my release on parole to testify. Marie Schroeder, Walter Schroeder's widow, talked about her fear for her children who are police officers when they go out to work every day, how she cannot speak to her grandchildren about this fear that their mother or father will never come home again. His brother testified that the 4.5 years I'd spent in prison were not enough to pay for my crimes, particularly his brother's murder. 2 of the older Schroeder sons testified about how their lives had been changed, about how hard their lives were after the murder of their father. One said that he too had opposed the Vietnam War, but had been too busy with his college studies to protest. They could have been my friends and colleagues in Oregon, these men. They could have been my cousins. They requested that the board members deny my application for parole and require that I serve my whole sentence in prison. Through all this, I sat on the sidelines with tears streaming, listening, opening my heart, watching for some moment when I would discern what to do or say that would address their sorrow and loss, that would express my contrition. Then it was Claire Schroeder's turn to speak. She's the oldest daughter of Officer Schroeder and was often the spokesperson of the family to the press. She addressed my written statement and all that I said in the hearing. She spoke scathingly about our gun-toting romanticism that had left her father dead. She told the story of the killing of one of her brothers and how the person who killed him was charged with manslaughter and sentenced to a few years in prison. They did not feel it was enough, but that is what the law said, and they honored it. She talked about my surrender and plea agreement. I was to be sentenced to serve 8 to 12 years. Again, they did not feel this was enough, but it was all the law could offer them. They accepted. And now she doesn't even want to keep that agreement, Claire said. Right then, I thought of every peace process I had ever learned about, how the 2 sides each held their narrative of the history, how peace broke through when one side could see the other side's narrative as legitimate, at least equally with their own. To my loved ones, the agreement that I would return home in 5 years. That the release would be on parole was a meaningless distinction. I had done my time, done my inner work. To Walter Schroeder's people, that sentence means serving the entire time behind bars in a medium security prison, away from ordinary life and family. Finally, she noted the eloquence of my acceptance of responsibility for my crimes in my statement and found it wanting in sincerity. Where was remorse when I surrendered, and in every statement I had made since then? She pointed out that anyone with half a brain would know they had to take responsibility and show remorse to be paroled. In that moment, I knew what to do. I was returned to the table before the board to make any final remarks. It is clear, I said to them, that what I came here to do today, which is to express my unconditional remorse for my actions in the murder of Walter Schroeder, cannot be accomplished as long as it is attached to a request to be released on parole. Therefore, I withdraw my parole request. There followed a stunned silence and the shuffling of papers. The head of the board took up her pen and said, "Let me make sure I have this right. You are withdrawing your request for parole?" She read back what I had said, and I affirmed it. I was escorted into the next room and manacled again. The officers walked me through the hallways and down the stairs, out into the night that had fallen by now. Flashbulbs popped, reporters shouted questions. I ignored them. I thought what I had done would probably become another big news story, but I did not care. All that was in another universe of fighting and enemies, not the world of the open heart I had somehow found my way into in those last moments. Sometimes that's hard to read. I want to talk briefly about how those actions were received. That night, as we all exited from the building where the parole hearing was, I wasn't speaking. I had an attorney, he wasn't speaking. The members of the parole board could not speak. Claire and Aaron Schroeder, the two daughters in the family, came out and stood there in front of the press, and they said, "We believe her." And a number of years later, Helen Whitney made a series of films on forgiveness for the Fetzer Institute for the Study of Religion and Society. And she said she really didn't like the concept, but she had read a chapter about what I had done, and that was what she wanted to explore. And so I spent 8 hours on camera, grueling, revisiting of some of these things. And she didn't tell me, and I didn't know until the film came out, that she had spent hours on camera with Claire Schroeder as well. And there's a very powerful scene where Helen Whitney asks Claire Schroeder about forgiveness. And Claire says, that moment where her life and my life intersected are there, and she will always be that moment for me. But that doesn't mean she should not go on to have the life she hopes to have, and I wish her well in it. Peace broke out. Peace broke out.